Welcome to our thought leadership webinar on new developments in clinical trial supply, powered by our Nside software. My name is Chris, and I'm an account executive here at Nside, speaking to you today from sunny Boston, Massachusetts, and joined by my Nside colleagues who work every day mitigating supply chain risk. And today you'll be learning some of our secrets of how to reduce clinical trial supply risk from our extensive experience in a variety of clinical trials, then diving deep into those secrets with a case study. Please note this session will be recorded so that you can share with your teams or any colleague that you think may benefit. Now, why have we chosen this topic today? I would say it wasn't so much our choice as it was chosen for us by feedback from our clients and the industry. Perhaps some of you are at a company where risk reduction is a new company priority. If not, you very well may be experiencing this soon. Whatever the case, more and more of our clients and partners tell us that getting their clinical trials across the finish line with minimum disruptions is no longer enough. They're now expected to proactively manage risk to their clinical supply chains so that everyone from patients to partners to upper management can feel more secure. In other words, it's no longer enough to fight fires in your supply chain. What we're expected to do in our industry is build the chain out of fireproof materials. How do we do it? We'll get into that in just a moment, but first, some quick housekeeping as we will move to our second slide. Just to orient you to our demo platform, here is the quick map of it. So you see your full screen option highlighted in orange here. You can also see how to reduce your chat and poll area, which we will be using with the blue arrow highlighting it. You can use the settings wheel to check your sound. And when we use the chat, I encourage everyone to please use as much as possible. We'd like to have a two-way conversation. During the introduction, the conclusion, the chat will be open to everyone in public mode. During the webinar, the chat will be available to gather your questions together. It will be set in private mode. And after the presentation, we'll select some of the questions to share with the audience and the speakers and answer those towards the end. If we have a poll as well, poll questions will pop up on the left side of the screen. Answers will be anonymous, so we have blinded these questions for you. And after answering a poll, you can come back to the chat area and see everything. And we are also joined by our technical host. Thank you so much to Megan for joining us from marketing at Nside to support as well. So moving on, a quick overview of our company. Just a quick get to know us. Here's some vital stats. And three things I'd like to highlight here. At the top, we do create optimizing solutions. Now, lots of companies do say optimizing these days when in fact they just mean automating. The difference is our solutions don't just do things automatically. They improve things automatically and incrementally over and over and over. And that incremental process reduces risk. Second thing to highlight, how's this been working out for us? Well, if our growth has been any indication, where just last year we grew at 70%, finally broke out of our modest 40% growth we'd been stuck with for a few years. We're really happy to say we appear to be providing products that are really valued by this community. And we deliver a lot of benefits, it seems, as people are voting with their business. And third, quick highlight, our increasing worldwide reach seems to really back that up too. Having now reached a significant number of pharma partners of all sizes and optimized over 10,000 trials and counting. And we're not done yet. So without further ado, let's see what all the to-do is about as I turn the slides over to my colleagues and a quick introduction to them. I'll be joined today by Amari DeAndre, our Head of Business Development Engineering, and Maxine Derip, our Senior Consultant in Life Sciences. And please, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. As you've heard, we are going to be talking about risk in clinical supply chain, and mainly how can we help you solve those risks, identify those risks, find solutions to avoid them altogether in your clinical supply chain. We all know how painful having risks can be in a clinical supply. It can impact the patients. It will definitely impact the investigators too. It impacts yourselves as clinical supply chain managers because firefighting, working over hours to solve this kind of issues is not something that we do with pleasure. So for today's topic, we will be following a flow that is similar to the methodology that we use at Enside to solve and identify risks in clinical trial supply chain. We will start first by introducing to what we mean by risk, because all of us, we work in different companies and different organizations. We have different definitions for the word risk and what it entails. So we'll start by that, just defining what it means. Before we get into the methodology, how do we identify and quantify the risks? What do we use at Enside, and what methodologies can you use on your side to identify those risks, quantify them, identify the causes of the risks too? So we'll also be sharing some experience on what are the main causes of risks and drug shortages in clinical supply chain that we've observed in the past years at Enside. And finally, of course, sharing the solutions. So, of course, it's going to be non-exhaustive. It's impossible to list everything into a presentation, but we will be talking together, sharing some experiences about typical solutions that we can easily implement to mitigate risks in the clinical trial supply chain, and also how to quantify the impact of those solutions on the patients and on actually minimizing that risk. The whole presentation will be illustrated by a case study where we will illustrate all of these different steps of identifying risks, identifying causes, identifying solutions, quantifying solutions. It's a case study that we worked on a couple of years ago at Enside, where we identified that 425 patients would miss a visit if no actions were taken in the short term. And we'll finish the presentation by giving some tips and tricks on how to proactively avoid risks in the clinical trial supply chain by having a supply chain strategy that is robust enough to avoid those. So let's get started. So first, what do we mean by risk? Let's introduce very quickly the concept of risk in clinical supply chain. The definition that we use for risk is the probability of impacting a patient's treatment by not having drug available at the time of the dispensing visit. That's the simplest definition of risk in clinical supplies, basically. But it also means that risk could happen at any stage of the supply chain. If we have at some point a delay in the release of a drug product batch, it could 4, 5, 6, 8 months later impact the patients because we might have a stock out in the supply chain. So on our side, we have also two concepts to define the risk, as it can happen anywhere in the supply chain. Where it matters the most actually is at the site level. We need to have the drug at the site level at the right moment. So we will call a risk of misdispensing any risk of not having enough kits or enough drug available at the site at the time of the dispensing, but drug might actually be available upstream in the supply chain. So it means that having a misdispensing is typically caused by an IRT configuration that is not robust enough to cover the recruitment and the demands of the ongoing patients in the clinical trial. But it could also be caused by a much faster recruitment, actually, or a higher demand, higher titrations from the patient that are at that site specifically. That would be what we call the misdispensing. Now, of course, we also have risks of drug shortage throughout the supply chain that can happen and therefore create misdispensing visits at the site that are not linked to the IRT configuration, but more to the fact that we don't have enough drug throughout the supply chain at the right time. And these can be caused by hundreds of different situations. I mean, we've gone through COVID this year. We know that a lot of delays in shipments and sometimes in release timelines happened. We know that we can have a big shortage on a comparator globally and therefore not be able to source it anymore. We can have unexpected events, delays in batch releases. We can have planning issues to a lot of different things, unfortunately, can happen in a clinical trial because we are in an uncertain world. And therefore, we're going to define any risk that is caused by missed drug in the end-to-end supply chain as being a drug shortage or a stockout. So let's start with a poll question. I want to ask you a question today. So in the past 24 months, have you experienced in your supply chain any kind of risk? Have you felt at some point that you could be at risk in your supply chain? The first answer is yes, I have experienced important shortage risks. I hope it didn't happen too frequently. Yes, I have experienced light risks that, of course, were manageable, or I have not experienced any risks at any time in the past 24 months. So I see that people are answering. Thank you very much for taking the time. As we have quite a lot of attendees today, I'm going to leave a couple of seconds more for people to choose their answers. And I think we can go ahead and analyze the results. So we've got 44% of the attendees that answered that they have experienced an important risk of shortage in their supply chain this year, and about 50% that have experienced light risks. Only one person was lucky enough to say that he has not experienced any risk, which is, well, two persons now, actually, which is really great. So this actually confirms something that we were expecting to get in this poll. Risks happen in the clinical trial supply chain. They happen because everything is uncertain. We don't know how the recruitment is going to happen. We don't know how patients will react to the treatment, whether they will need to change doses. We don't know if we're going to have a temperature excursion. We don't know if we're going to have a good yield in the manufacturing lots. So many things can happen and go wrong that it is not rare indeed to face this kind of issues in the supply chain. So I think this is a great introduction to the topic of this webinar, and let's now get into the deal and talk about how we can identify these risks and solve them. So the methodology that we use at Enside to do this is basically we start by identifying the risks. And I'm going to leave the floor to my colleague Maxime in a couple of seconds to explain you how we identify those risks. What methodology do we use to quantify them? But also we need to understand the causes, because if we understand the causes, it's easier to find ideas to mitigate those problems and avoid the risks altogether. So of course, the next steps would be to ideate, have ideas, generate solutions that would solve that risk, prioritize them, because some of them might not be feasible. Some of them we might not want to implement them, like, for example, slowing down the recruitment. And then we're going to simulate the impact of those solutions on the risks and ensure that we avoid the risk altogether in order to have a robust plan and implement the solutions in the end. So I'll invite my colleague on stage now to explain to you how to identify risk in a clinical trial.
Hello, everyone. Glad to see that you could all came today. So what we're really going to see right now is how to actually identify risk in a clinical trial, really following that methodology that Amaury just explained. The first step in identifying risk in a clinical trial is really making sure that we have the right tool. And the tool that we're using at Enside is a risk-based optimization system. So the particularity of a risk-based optimization system is that it's including Monte-Carlo simulation. So the point of this webinar today is not to go too technical or to explain all the mathematical concept, but the idea of the Monte-Carlo simulation is really to capture all the uncertainty that is inherent to the clinical trial world. So the idea is really to make sure that we're going to capture all this uncertainty. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate 1,000 ways the trial can go. So in some simulation, what we might have is patient being recruited a little bit faster, maybe being a little bit heavier than initially expected, and staying in the trial a little bit longer. In some other simulation, might be the opposite. We might have patient recruited a little bit slower, or maybe patient that will stay in the study on a shorter period of time. So the dropout might be more important. And for every parameter, every statistics, we're going to run 1,000 of simulations. So at the end, what we're going to have, and that's really what you're going to see on the first pictogram here, is an accurate representation of the forecast with minimum and maximum. And the minimum and the maximum that we're going to have, those curves, are really going to be the capture of the uncertainty around the clinical trials. Also, because we're able to capture a robust forecast, not only in terms of actually how many kits will be dispensed to patient, but also at what point in time, well, the tool is able to provide concrete recommendations. So typically an IMP release plan, so how many kits need to be released at what point in time. The idea is also that we can include different constraints or analyze different deviation from those forecasts to really do a risk assessment. And by risk assessment, the tool is actually going to tell us when and where and how many kits we might be missing to actually satisfy the patient supply continuity. So the idea of the risk-based optimization, just to repeat, is really to make sure we're capturing all the uncertainty in clinical trial and that we don't need to rely on other parameters or other system or just Excel files to actually compute or forecast. So how can this be represented? That's going to be our following slide right here. Well, what you're seeing here are 3 lines on the graph. The first one, the green one that you're going to see, is the average. It's really linked to the assumptions that you've been taken for your clinical trial. So you'll have the recruitment projection provided by ClinOps. You'll also have the protocol, the different dropout assumption, dispensing assumptions, and that's the average case that's going to be represented. On top of that, what you're going to see are the 2 orange lines. And the 2 orange lines, they really represent the minimum and the maximum. What do we mean by that? Well, out of 1,000 simulation, in some simulation, you're going to really going to have a case where patient demand is more important. Well, because patients have been recruited faster, because they stay longer in the trial, and so forth. And you're also going to have some case where, well, patient, they don't stay in the trial that long, and that's really going to be our minimum. And what you see, those 2 orange lines, it's really going to be our cone of confidence. And that cone of confidence, well, that's the robustness of our model, making sure that, well, we can kind of allow some small deviation in our initial assumption. How would that translate when your trial has started and you actually have information coming from your patient? Well, that's what we're going to see here on the next slide. Well, looks like I went a bit too fast. What we're going to see on this slide right here is, well, the pink line, and the pink line is representative of the actual. So actually, what kind of consumption did our patient already enrolled in the trial would have? And here we see, well, we're slightly deviating from our average. So here we see that we're getting really close to our maximum. But because our model is actually super robust, we know that at this point in time, well, no action needs to be taken because the actual are still within the bounds of our forecast, so that minimum and that maximum. So at this point in time, everything is going well in the trial and no action needs to be taken. On the other hand, what would happen if right now we see that the actual, they go up, they deviate from our upper bound. So we see that our patient consumption is actually more important than expected. Well, here we know that action needs to be taken. Our forecasts and the recommendation, they are not covering the reality anymore, really what's happening in the trial. So at this point in time, we know, and it's not sure yet that risk will be induced in the trial, that just we need to reforecast our future and making sure that we're taking into account those actuals. What do we mean by it's not yet sure that we have risk? Well, it might just be an issue. We recruit more patients in a certain depot, and the only action that we need to take is making sure that we have a depot resupply leaving earlier than initially forecasted. If the deviation is too important, then of course what we're going to see is risk occurring in the trial, and that risk needs to be mitigated. And that's going to be for the second part here of our webinar. Now, really the idea of a risk-based optimization system is really that we can make sure that we can pinpoint exactly where and when risk might happen. For a more deterministic, let's say, approach, so really making, without considering those minimum and maximum, well, if we have a deviation, like you can see here with the pink line, we're not sure if we're actually covering that case or if we're directly at risk or if it's just a matter of taking action. So making sure that you're using a risk-based optimization system will really provide you more insights on when and where your risk might happen, and actually, are you at risk, yes or no? We're going to see right now in the following slides, well, what do we do and what does it look like to actually have risk in your trial? And the first example that we'd like to take is the following graph that you're seeing here. Well, what you see here is a graph with some blue bars, and you can see that the blue bars, it's really a risk of misdispensing. So as Amaury explained a little bit earlier, the risk of misdispensing is probably linked to a configuration of your RT that's not robust enough. And we have patients coming to sites and, well, they are missing their dose, but we can expect the kits to be in the upstream part of the supply chain. What you're seeing here is really typical output of a risk-based optimization system. And what it's providing you, it's, well, how many patients are actually impacted by the shortage? What's the beginning of the risk periods? what's the end also of the risk period, and what's actually the duration of the risk period. Here we see that in this trial, there is risk induced starting January 22nd all the way until, well, August, September 23. Finally, the tool also tell you when and where risk might happen. So here what we see is that, well, it's located in Belgium, France, and the US for this fictive trial that we have. And it's located on the placebo and the active. And finally, the last column is really giving us an idea on what's the intensity, on how many patients are we actually missing there. And here what we can draw as a conclusion, so it's a fictive trial, and we know that the randomization period is going from January all the way until September 23. It's really that the buffers that we have at site level, they are not covering the whole patient demand. So that means that probably buffers are too low. Many patients are coming, being randomized, and there are not buffers for everyone, for kids for their treatments. And therefore, patients that are missing their dose, they have to come back another day when the kits are available. So right here, we could identify the risk. Let's take maybe here another example. Well, we have the same situation. We have a risk that's identified in Brazil. But this time, it's not a risk of misdispensing. It's a risk of out of stocks or shortage. So there are no kits available in the supply chain anymore. So what's happening? Well, we see that we have risk in May 22nd, and in this trial, we were supposed to have a release in March 22, and we were supposed to send kids to Brazil. So we all know that to get to Brazil, it takes a long time because of paperwork and admin. It can take up to 2 or 3 months. So here, the release of March was delayed, meaning that, well, we had the kits maybe in April, but it was still, we still had to send those kits over to Brazil. It takes a long time. So that's why in May, we had also a higher demand in Brazil. All kits were consumed, and we had a risk of shortage, time for the new kits to be available at the local depot and then sent to the different sites. And here, that's really not of stock that was identified. Now, we're going to have an additional question for you, and it is, what have been the main causes of risk in your supply chain? So just previously, when Amory was asking the question, we've been using the poll. And if you look at the top right corner of your screen, you'll see there's also a chat. And we really invite you to write some causes of your risk in your supply chain directly in the chat. And my colleague Amory will come back on stage and kind of analyze the answers.
Thank you very much, Maxime. Indeed. So as we've seen that a lot of the participants have had risks in their supply chain in the past months. It could be interesting to share a little bit all of the causes that you've seen as being creating actually these risks in your supply chain. Now, I see that answers are flowing. Don't worry, you're not the only one answering. It's just that the chat is in private. I see that people are writing down shipment delays, expire extensions that were not approved, unexpected recruitment, long lead times for disposables for manufacturing, stockouts due to temperature excursions, lack of carriers due to COVID, delayed releases, faster recruitments again. We have really a lot of things that are linked to shipment distribution delays, to faster recruitments, to availability of drug or commercial ancillary products that are currently out of stock. Longer release lead times are there too, raw material shortages. This is extremely complete. Manpower shortage, that's true. Very often we see packaging lines that are overloaded with work and end up having some delays. Lack of forecasting, that's an important one too. Indeed, planning is an issue sometimes. Well, great. I mean, there's so many answers, I'm not even going to be able to read all of them, but we have a good idea of typical causes that are met by people on a daily basis. Let me now share some of our experience, some observations that we've had in the past years. We've actually organized the causes into 4 categories. The first category is an issue that is causing a reduced drug availability in the supply chain at a specific time point. This could be created by quality issues, that is reducing the yield of manufacturing, delays in batch releases. It could be created by global shortage on comparators or ancillaries, like it was mentioned in the chat. Inaccurate planning, so lack of forecasting or bad forecasting, expiry reductions or not getting an extension, or having no global view on the supply chain activities, which would mean that we might not do a good allocation of lots across clinical trials. Filled productions, of course, enter here. Scarce comparators enter here. So we can really see a lot of things that were shared in the chat that are linked to the specific category of problems that are reducing drug availability. The next category is issues that are increasing the demand. These would be faster recruitments, lower dropouts, higher titrations, heavier patients if it's a weight-based dispensing, protocol amendments that are increasing the number of patients in the clinical trial. These also happen very often. Of course, clinical trials being completely uncertain and unpredictable, this category is actually a big one. Then we have anything that would be increasing shipping lead times and therefore delaying arrival of drug on sites. These can be created by customs lead times, political changes like the Brexit, pandemics of COVID, which are creating manpower shortages, delays at the warehouses, or closing down of warehouses, actually, natural disasters like the volcano a couple of years back. And finally, the last category is problems that are creating an increased need in the supply chain, increased buffers. So this would actually be caused by an increase in the number of sites or depots that you have in your clinical trial. We've seen it happen sometimes that some clinical trials end up having an IRT configuration where all sites are on high independently of their recruitment plans, therefore emptying the local depots and feeding the sites only, which means that the depots are empty in case we have a specific demand on one of the sites. Bugs in the IRT system have happened, temperature excursions, storage issues, which are creating also losses or broken kits or excursions. And this is not exhaustive. There are hundreds of causes, of course, that would be potentially creating risks in the supply chain. So now let's illustrate this with a case study. We've shown you how to identify the risks and how to identify the causes and what would be the typical causes in the supply chain. Here, we're going to talk about a case study that we've worked on and illustrate these first two steps through that case study. So this is actually a case study that we worked on starting in in August 2018. So it's quite an old case study, but it's very relevant to today's topic. It was an oncological trial with 900 patients with about 8 to 10 SKUs or kit types that were weight-based dispensing or body surface area dispensing, had titrations, global clinical trial with 220 sites, a short shelf life of 12 months, and a very, very high sourcing budget due to the comparator cost. We were involved 6 months in. 30% of the patients had already been included in the clinical trial. 70% of the sites were opened, and we were actually called in by the CRO that was that actually realized that there was going to be a very big issue in the supply of the clinical trial. So we started working at the end of August 2018 when the trial had started in February. And the first thing we did was model this trial into our solution, run the simulations, and see what's going to happen. And what came out was not a pretty picture. We had a very, very important risk of stockout. There were shortages that were going to happen 2 months in, so 2 months after we started working as of October 2018, and it was going to last for 5 or 6 months afterwards. What were the issues there? Well, first we had an expire replacement coming at the end of September. There were some stocks at the depots. They were not high enough to cover both the expire replacement and the upcoming demands. The next release was in January, which was a bit too late, and we also had quite a long lead time to get to some depots like Argentina and Brazil, meaning that despite the release in January, risk of stockout was still happening in February and March. In total, 425 missed dispensing visits were assessed here. And what were the actual issues that were happening in this clinical trial? There were multiple, unfortunately, of them, which is why it was an excellent case study for today. The initial forecasting was considering an overage of 20%, which was a manual calculated overage. If we had optimized this trial from scratch from the beginning, we would have recommended 51% of overage, not 20%, just because of all the decision that had taken of the protocol design, of the short shelf life, of the IRT configuration that was fixed. Because of all of that, we would have needed 51% and not 20%. But we also had a much higher demand than expected with a 20% longer patient treatment. It was oncology, and patients were staying 10 cycles on average instead of 8. They had a higher weight than expected. They were recruiting 30% faster. They didn't have the titrations when patients were supposed to go to half their current dose. 30% of the patients were supposed to do that. It didn't happen. They had a global shortage of comparator on the commercial market. They were not able to source carboplatin anymore. And on top of that, the RT configuration was not optimal, which means that a lot of drug was going from from depot to site and emptying the depots way too fast. Finally, we also realized that the planning was not optimal at the very beginning. They had overproduced at the beginning, and so all of the expiries that were happening in September 2018, could have been avoided. They could actually have sourced less drug at the beginning, planned for less packaging at the beginning. It's just that the timing of the demand was not correctly forecasted, unfortunately, from the beginning. So if you were in a case like this, what would you do? Or if you have faced risk in the past 24 months, what have you done to mitigate that risk? What are the go-to actions that you typically implement to avoid that risk? And once again, we're going to use the chat here, so feel free to share your ideas on the chat, whether it is updating the RT configuration or doing a site-to-site shipment or slowing down the recruitment. There's hundreds of ideas. So let's take again 1 or 2 minutes to share some ideas in the chat like earlier today. So normally the chat is open. And I'll leave the floor to my colleague Maxime to analyze your responses.
Thank you, Amaury. So I see already a lot of answers. So we have performing site-to-site shipments, making sure that kits on one site can be sent to others. Definitely a lot of paperwork, but it can really work. We have slowing down the recruitment, definitely a good option to reduce future demand, but also then kind of impacting the timelines for the end of the trial. I see here having speeding up the depot shipments. So making sure we can maybe send them to quarantine or kits to reduce the lead times. Closer dialogues with ClinOps, trying to make sure we can react to uncertainties or actually make those uncertainties become predictable. I see here conservatively calculate the buffer to overestimate a little bit. Definitely an option. Strengths planning and clinical projection. Yes, making sure that everything is can be anticipated in the future. Reducing our packaging timelines, making sure we can release our kits earlier. I see that you guys are answering a lot. That's definitely super, but I cannot follow. Better production planning. Those are a lot of solutions, maybe a bit more proactively. But let's deep dive into also a thorough list that we've been building through our experience at Inside. So there are 4 different categories. The first idea is really to make sure that we can increase our drug availability, or at least in the short term. So how can it be? It's expedite the next release, making sure that, well, we can have our kits available earlier. So it's making sure that we can reduce the lead time, so different packaging and labeling activities. Maybe getting drugs from another trial, just relabel them, or if you have some bright stock, label them for your trials, making sure that those kits can be available as soon as possible. If you have old batch, maybe consider some expiry extensions if you have the stability data for so. Another idea could be to reduce the short-term demand, something that's sometimes a little bit more touchy, but definitely something that can be envisioned. So changing the dispensing schedule. So, for instance, if you have visits every 2 months where they will take a lot of kits, just try to have visits every week or every 2 weeks where they will take a bit less kits, increasing your flexibility at site and local depot. We could have slowing down the recruitment, definitely one of the last options that we want to explore, but in the worst case, that's something that can be done, making sure that we diminish in the short term our patient demand to already satisfy patients that are already enrolled in our trial. Another category could be, speeding up a little bit the process to get our drug where it's needed. So as we had in the poll, it's accelerate our shipping lead times, trying to ship under quarantine. We could remove some blinding constraints. So we might have a blinding constraint where we need to send kits, for instance, of active and placebo, both of them at site, depleting our local depots, trying to remove that constraint to once again increase our flexibility, trying to ship more frequently to our depot to this time leverage our flexibility at the central depot. There are a lot of different options really that can be investigated here. And then finally, trying also to reduce the need for buffers, so more specifically at site level. So we could close some sites that, are not recruiting, are closed for recruitment, or maybe just that haven't performed well, making sure that we're closing them before an expiry replacement event, so to keep, again, more kits at your local depot. We could update our IRT configuration, making sure that we're sending kits more frequently to our sites, but then shorter quantities. in a position to having less frequent shipment and sending a lot of quantities to your site. So once again, to leverage your flexibility, could try to customize your RT algorithm, maybe put a constraint, a certain minimum screening period to get rid of your buffers, making sure that you're only managing your whole trial with prediction through your RT, or simply pause the initiation of new sites and new depot to make sure that, well, new buffers don't need to be considered and further constrain your supply chain. So what we see is that, well, there are a lot of different options can be investigated. So we don't have to resort directly to a few options like slowing down the recruitment or having to stress the whole supply chain to have another release. The main idea is really to make sure that, well, we can identify the risk, identify the causes of risk, and then brainstorm the right solution that will actually have an impact. Once we know the impact, well, it's important to test it. And here I'm going to let Amory take the floor and keep going with the case study and how this was implemented.
Absolutely. So, of course, the list here is non-exhaustive, and it will depend on each clinical trial to see which solutions will be the best to mitigate certain risks. To come back to the case study that we talked about earlier, you remember we had these 425 missed dispensing visits that were forecasted. Here's a list that we don't need to go through into detail that NSIDE proposed as solutions to mitigate that risk. A lot of these ideas were impacting IRT configuration, distribution challenges, even protocol design sometimes during the clinical trial, because we were recommending to update the dispensing scheme and the dispensing schedule. Of course, some of these ideas are not feasible. For example, updating the dispensing schedule was not accepted because one thing we could have done here was adding visits or unscheduled visits between planned visits in the protocol today to minimize the dispensing in the short term and give, for example, only one kit to patients and instead of two, and have them come back a bit earlier to get the second kit. It was not something that the ClinOps felt comfortable doing. It definitely impacts patient centricity, so it was discarded as being not an option. And we could also have slowed down the recruitment, but that's definitely the last thing that even us, we don't want to do. And it's also because we don't want to impact patients that we are working together to solve these risks through other innovative solutions. Then we also have to prioritize which are the solutions that are quick wins, that are easy to implement, that are quick and to get approval for, and which are the solutions that we know are going to require a bit more of stakeholder input, a bit more of validation, a bit more of work or investment or money to make happen. For example, shipping kits under quarantine requires validation from the QPs, the CRO, the CMO, and the pharmaceutical company side. So it was definitely not something that they wanted to prioritize. Updating the dispensing scheme and dispensing more of the 100 milligram kits instead of the 400, because this was a combined treatment. So patients getting 2,000 milligrams were getting 5 kits of 400 milligrams. Those who were receiving 1,000 milligrams were getting 2 of 400, 2 of 100. So in this scenario, what we wanted was to shift the demand towards the 100 milligram that were present in the inventories in much higher quantities than the 400. This was not very patient-friendly either, so not a priority. And finally, closing sites was also not a priority because if at some point those sites started to become more proactive in recruiting, it could definitely be positive for the recruitment timelines. So we started by the actions that we wanted to implement first. So if we come back to our risk, you remember our baseline, we had these 425 missed dispensings in the clinical trial. The first step, the first thing we want to do is, as we have a release in January, we want to postpone that risk as much as possible and ideally until January so that when we have that new release, we're fine, we're good, and the risk is normally gone. So what's the first action that is easy to do and implement is to re-optimize the IRT configuration, reducing buffers, removing some of the blinding constraints that we had there. So when, for example, one shipment was shipping kits of active, we always needed to include 2 kits of placebo or comparator in the shipment. We brought that down to 1 instead of 2, and it helped a little bit. We reduced the buffers on the site. We reduced the prediction. We reduced the do not ship and do not count values. We asked the IRT to customize the algorithm to have something a bit more flexible and adapted to the trial needs. And as you see, if I go back to the previous slide, the risk is really reducing quite considerably. And we're already postponing the risk by 2 months. And now it's not in October anymore, it's in December. By optimizing the RT configuration, we're keeping the kits at the depot instead of keeping them as buffers on the sites. Because when they're arriving at the sites, we cannot use them anymore in other sites. So if the demand is super high in one of the sites in the United States, for example, we would rather have the kits at the depot to be able to ship them to that site. So by doing this, we saved 2 months, which is great. What else could we do? Well, we changed the dispensing scheme. It's not something they wanted to do, but we ended up coming to the conclusion that it was the easiest option. And after getting approval from clinical operations, it was tested in our solution. And you can see that the risk in December is, and in January too, is reducing a little bit. We still have some risk in December. We still have some risk in January, but the impact was quite interesting to consider. Then we did some depot-to-depot shipments. There was one depot in Latin America that was a bit too overfilled with drug, and that was not recruiting as planned. So we decided to bring that drug back to another depot that had higher needs. Of course, that took some time, and it took some coordination with the CMO, which did a lot of efforts to make it happen, but they did, and therefore we postponed the risk by an additional month. And now we're down to January. We just have to manage beginning of January and the depots like Brazil and Argentina, who are extremely far away and will require long lead times to get there. Next solution was closing down sites and one depot. Out of the 220 sites, and let's say about 170 of those were already opened, 45 had recruited close to no patients in the first 6 months of the clinical trial. So we had a recruitment performance that was extremely low. And if we closed them right before the expiry replacement, which was in September 2018, we would save about 2,000 kits of buffers on those sites that could be reused in other countries in the future. This was a very impactful solution. As you can see, it reduced the risk very much in January, and now we only need to manage Argentina and Brazil in February and March and get those kits that are released in January to those countries as fast as possible. Then we have the last solution, which was actually reducing the lead times of shipment to those depots. So by coordinating with the CMO again, we were able to do two things. First, reduce the packaging and labeling lead times. Second, reduce the shipping lead time. Third, which was something that was not only with the CMO, but was a coordination also with ClinOps and the sponsor, was to ensure that we could ship kits under quarantine before the QP release, so that actually the QP release was going to happen when the kits were being transported to those depots. By doing that, we saved about 1 month in the arrival to the depots and saved 1 month in the release timelines. And instead of having the release in January, we had the release in December, and we were able to get the kits to the depot very, very quickly. So in the end, if we look at the summary of all of these solutions, we went from 425 patients missing a dispensing to down to 0 with a couple of efficiently implemented solutions. The good news is that these solutions also had a very positive impact on budget, because by optimizing the RT configuration, we saved about 1 million in future sourcing. By changing the dispensing scheme, we consumed drug that was going to expire in the 100 milligram kit type. By closing sites, we also saved in distribution and buffer costs too. Of course, the depot-to-depot shipments and reducing lead times increased a little bit the cost, but not as much as the other solutions reduced them. The good news is we didn't have to slow down the recruitment. This trial actually ended 3 months earlier than the initial planning, because we were able to guarantee trial continuity and supply continuity to the patients without actually slowing down that recruitment. And it is something that can be done in the clinical trials in which you find risk, and hopefully not a risk that is as high as this one, because this is definitely not a fun situation to be in. And for us at Enside, this was basically a 5 days project. We get the request and we set up the instance, we start working on it, and within 5 days of very strong collaboration with the sponsor, we can get to a very efficient assessment and solutions to be implemented. Now, of course, ideally, we would not have to go through this, because planning would be done in advance to avoid risk altogether. There's always things we will never be able to avoid, but with a good planning, with a good optimization, we can do quite an amazing job. And I'll invite my colleague back to the floor here to talk a bit about that.
Thank you, Amaury. So yeah, as the conclusion said, indeed, there are super nice things to do in case of risk. We want to make sure that patient will never be impacted. But at the end of the day, mitigating risk is not really what we want to do. What we want to do is making sure that in advance, proactively, we can anticipate the risk and making sure that at no point in time, we need to have supply chain managers that are stressed, patients that are potentially at risk, and have to kind of ask some organizations, some CMO to do extra efforts to really deliver drugs on time. So how to do so, and here's a little timeline that we build, is really at trial design is trying to make sure that supply chain is also involved in discussion with ClinOps to make sure that, well, trials can be more supply friendly and that less constraint will be put on the supply chain. So this seems easy to say. This could actually be a whole webinar on itself because there are so many possibilities. But the idea is that we have several levers that we can really influence really at trial design, like the visit interval, minimum screening periods, choice of the RT, choice of the vendor. And there are so many options that can be tested that can actually reduce the overage and the waste level in your clinical trial. That is really worth it to make sure that, well, supplies can be also involved at really early stages of the trial design. Another interesting point is definitely to make sure also that we have some scenario planning. So what do we mean by scenario planning is, well, making sure that we have options and that we have considered all the different possibilities. We will want to make sure that we react to uncertainty, and we want to make sure that we have considered everything. So what do we mean? Well, what if the first release, there might be some discussion that the yield might be lower than expected, or maybe that the shelf life won't be super good, is making sure that we go in one direction, but what we have a contingency plan in place in case something goes south, and really make sure we can anticipate it instead of just reacting it when it's getting too late. Also, something super important is making sure that we can safely initiate all local depots in our site on time, making sure we have the right IRT configuration that's optimal for the trial. So making sure that we have stocks at site and a flexibility at the local depot also to react to some uncertainties. And then finally, when your trial is started, that you have your first patient in, what's super important is to monitor your trial. So as we saw earlier, with a risk-based optimization tool, for instance, what you might have is some robust forecast with a maximum and a minimum bound. Well, monitoring your trial is making sure that we stay within those bounds. If at some point we deviate from those bounds, well, we just have to redo some simulation, probably readapt a little bit our recommendations, so trigger the shipment earlier than initially expected, maybe increase the next release because we see that we're going to need more kits because, well, your recruitment might have been faster than expected. There are a lot of little options that can be put in place. At some point, there might be some heavy deviation from your initial assumption. So you might lose the entirety of your release, or you might recruit 2 or 3 times faster than expected. Here you might then see some risk. And in this case, well, you have the possibility to mitigate your risk and test your solution. But really, the idea is make sure that our trial are supply friendly, and that on top of that, we're anticipating our risk rather than firefights and, well, put ourselves in super stressful situations. So if we needed to conclude this webinar, and thank you all for attending this, is really in extreme situation, well, there are a lot of options that are possible to mitigate risk. Well, first of all, identify your risk, identify the cause, the location, and quantify like how many kits am I missing. So the risk-based optimization system is going to help you do that. And it's also going to help you test your decisions. So first thing is to brainstorm your solutions, see what can actually be implemented. And then finally, well, quantify through simulation before implementing them. But as we just said, this is really nice, it's good, but that's not something we want. What we really want is make sure that we can proactively manage our risk and anticipate any kind of uncertainty in our clinical trial. How can that be? Well, by making sure our trials are more supply friendly, by making sure that we have good forecasts that are robust to uncertainty, by making sure that we have monitorings and alerts telling us when we're actually deviating from our assumptions. So there are a lot of things to be put in place preventively and making sure that we can avoid extreme situation all together as a collaboration. So thank you very much for your attending, and we'll let Chris take over for the questions.
Thank you, Maxime. All right. Hope everyone enjoyed that. Again, thank you, Amaury and Maxime, and thank you all for joining for this peek behind the curtains of how we are managing clinical trial risk with our Inside technology. It's entirely likely this has gotten you thinking about your own clinical trial risks. Thus, we really look forward to hearing you to reach out to us in the future. to discuss your clinical supply challenges specific to yourself and your company and your goals. Now, we had a few questions on this during the webinar. Yes, you will receive a follow-up summary with materials and access to the recording after this session. And we encourage you to please share with your team, with your colleagues that you think may benefit. We hope this really helps everyone to get thinking of how they can reduce risks for their patients and their partners, management, and more, and to really make everyone's lives better and more stress-free. We will now answer questions, and feel free to send any questions through the Demio. Let's see, we have a few here coming through. Very good. Yes, the recording will be shared later. That will be coming.
I can answer that indeed. So after the webinar, and I see a couple of people actually asked if the recording or the slides were going to be shared. Indeed, you will all be receiving the recording as well as a handout that summarizes the takeaways from the webinar. And slides are also available upon request. So if you're interested, please just let us know. We'll share the slides with you too. There's a couple of questions coming. That's great. So let's answer one here that I see from Carlos. There it is. So how do you get your clinical group to provide good, well-thought clinical projections? This seems to be a ClinOps CRO activity. However, it has been a challenge to get them to provide good projections. Yes. Well, I agree that it's definitely out of the control of the supply chain. But in our experience at NSAID, we have now worked on, I don't know, I think the latest number was close to 12,000 clinical trials in the past years. We end up having a lot of good practices in place and the collaboration between clinical operations, CROs, and clinical supply chain. And one of them includes actually having the supply chain challenge a bit the clinical operation assumptions, whether it is recruitment, dropout rates, titration probabilities, average weights for patients, and so on. What we realize is if we can challenge these assumptions, there's a lot more time and energy that is put into finding those and sharing those data in a relevant way with clinical supply chain. And more than that, if we suggest an idea based on our experience at NSAID, we end up creating a very nice two-way discussion with the ClinOps, and we can tell them, look, in past clinical trials we worked on this indication, we found that these were typical statistics that we've observed. And they end up sometimes just coming back to us with corrections on what we propose to them. It's very efficient.
And maybe just to extend on that, the idea is also that since we can quantify the decision, we can also show a scenario or two different options. What if the recruitment is more aggressive or less aggressive? What will really be the impact on the supply chain? And then ultimately on the cost and the budget of the trial, making sure that we all in the same boat together. And then at the end, it's also kind of a manner to make sure we can bring the discussion all together because we have numbers and we can actually discuss based on those numbers what will be the impact of this recruitment projection and how can we improve this, well, again, together.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the next question, there was a question here, how fast can you react? I think this question was asked right before we actually answered it early on in the presentation. So typically, if it's an emergency, like in this case, we know it's time sensitive. We know how important it is to be very fast. So if we get a request like that, as soon as we get an agreement together, we can start working on it. And within 5 days, normally, we're good to go. We have an answer to the issue. So other questions. Here's one from Falcone. How do you work with competing clinical programs and do you support during patient recruitment process as well? So the competing clinical programs are, it's always interesting. Competing the way I interpret it would be two ways. Either it's multiple clinical trials that are sharing the same drug product and are therefore competing to get the same drug product assigned to them. In maybe a scarce resource world, or we could be talking about manufacturing resource allocations, or even sometimes in the case that we have another competitor, another pharmaceutical company working on the same indications, we could have competing programs. So I don't really know what was the orientation of this question, but basically every time what we want to do is avoid impacting recruitment, avoid impacting timelines. So in any case, whether you are competing with your own clinical trials or competing with your own manufacturing resources or competing with an external company that is working on the same indication, if you are in a situation of risk like this that could put at risk the timelines of your commercialization and potentially put at risk also the the fact of being the market leader for a specific molecule, it's definitely the first thing we're going to think of is solving the issue without impacting those timelines. We want to ensure that that is realistic. And during patient recruitment, as Maxime illustrated, we typically recommend to monitor this. We have a very nice monitoring application that compares real-time data to the forecast and identifies if we have any outliers. So if the recruitment is much faster than expected and exceeds the risk line that we have drawn through the simulations, we get an alert right away and informed. So I hope this answers your question, Falguni. So another one is not a question, but it's always a very nice comment. Thanks, Dennis. So great webinar. Thank you very much. Please more of it. With a lot of pleasure. We'll continue creating content like this, and you also have access, if you want, on our website to past webinars in case you're interested in typical causes of drug waste and how to solve them, for example, how to collect efficiently data and how to challenge the data input that we have. That was our latest webinar in September. You can find all of that material online on our website. And of course, if you wish to follow up with us on the content of today's webinar, please just contact us. We have our email addresses right here. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us online on the website. Always happy to have a chat without any kind of engagement. We're just happy to be in the same industry as you guys and to share ideas that come through our minds and to learn new stuff. So hope to see you all very soon in future conferences, future exchanges, and please reach out in case you have any follow-up questions. And if any other questions arise, we'll make sure to answer by email to everyone that asks one.